Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I wanted to let you know, seems like the majority of people prefer this format where I have the full video in a box like so, and then that leaves kind of this black area. So I've been trying to work on what to do about that, and I want to let you know I'm playing with a few ideas as far as maybe like a frame, some things with social media and calls to action, that kind of stuff. I don't want to clutter it up too much, so if you have any suggestions about that, use that comment section below. I would love to hear them. I'm not really particularly artsy or, good with design, so it might take me a little bit of time, but I'm working on that. In the meantime, I do have a trip coming up in a couple weeks. Some of you have heard me talk about that. I'm going to be visiting the battlefield of Chickamauga, the battlefields around Chattanooga, as well as Chattanooga National Cemetery. Desmond Doss is buried there. The Andrews Raiders from the Civil War are buried there. I don't have a lot of time, but I will be there for all of one day and part of the next day before I head to Toccoa, Georgia, where I will be working on the base there to help clean things up on Currahee Mountain, where the guys from Band of Brothers trained. There will definitely be a lot of video from that for you as well. We're going to be sleeping in the barracks at the base. And then after my 2 days at Toccoa, I'm heading down to the southern part of Georgia, where I will be at Andersonville Prison. I will post the dates for all of that in a separate post, but on Discord we have a channel for that. If you haven't joined us on Discord, there's a link in the description that will take you over there. But the main reason I share all of that is because if you are in that area and you would like to join me for any of those visits to any of those sites, I would love to have you come along, maybe even include you in the videos that we make for those. Tour the battlefield together, it'd be a lot of fun. I usually do that stuff by myself, so it'd be great to have somebody else who's passionate about it join me. So on Discord, I'm going to create a private channel for anybody who even thinks they might be interested in joining me for that. And I will add you to that channel, and that way I can share specific updates about when and where I'm going to be, things like that. There's also a channel on there where I'm giving kind of the general stuff. But, and if you're not on Discord, you don't use it, send me a message through email, vloggingthroughhistory at gmail.com, and let me know, and I can communicate with you that way. Yesterday, a ton of people telling me I need to check out Armchair Historian. So we're diving into Armchair Historian today. I haven't watched any of his videos yet, but it seems like they're pretty highly recommended by you, the community, and I trust you guys. So we're going to check this out. And keeping with the theme of some of our videos recently, I want to look at, I saw he had a video about why the British lost the American Revolution. So I thought it'd be interesting to see his take on that and respond to it. I will be getting back to the Napoleonic Wars videos later on this week. So check those out. And also don't forget to check out my gaming channel, History Guy Gaming. There's daily content on there as well. All right, let's dive in.
This video was made possible entirely by our supporters on Patreon. Special thanks to my top patrons, Fritz, Joe Crispin, Brandon Wuwan, and Derek Bello. The following account is from Lieutenant J. Waller of the 1st Battalion Royal Marines.
Oh, he's a young guy. I like it. Good to see young people into history.
Quick march!
2 companies of the 1st Battalion of Marines and part of the 47th Regiment were the first that mounted the breastwork.
Don't fire until you see the whites of their
And you will
eyes,
not be
men.
displeased when I tell you that I was with
Take
those 2
aim.
companies,
Steady, lads!
who drove their bayonets into all that opposed them. Nothing could be more shocking than the carnage that followed the storming of this work. We gained a complete victory.
So I just have to express my appreciation. Not everybody gets this right, but they've got the right flag for the New England militia that was there at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So I appreciate that little attention to detail.
The Battle of Bunker Hill was one of the many gruesome battles of the American Revolution, a war that lasted a total of 8 years, approximately the same length as the American Civil War, Spanish-American War, and Mexican-American War combined.
Now, he's right about that. The war did last from 1775 to when peace was concluded in 1783. For the most part, combat ended in late 1781. I say for the most part because there was still a lot of fighting. In fact, I had an ancestor who was a lieutenant named James Felix McGuire, who was killed at the Battle of Blue Licks, Kentucky, and that was well into 1782. In fact, Daniel Boone had one of his sons killed at that battle as well. I've been to that site. It's a cool site to visit in northeastern Kentucky. So there was fighting, especially on the frontier, but the major armies, Washington's army, Clinton's armies, Cornwallis, etc., they were done fighting by the end of 1781.
It's clear then that in many ways the American Revolution was a war of attrition. But unlike prevailing belief, the war was not won simply because the British would fight in lines and the Americans would just hide in the bushes. All of America's most decisive victories were won in a conventional manner. But it was in the way that the Americans engaged the British, fighting on their own terms, that allowed them to outlast their enemy. I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and today we'll be evaluating the advantages and disadvantages that both sides faced, which ultimately decided the outcome of the war. Before we get to the video, I highly recommend you guys check out the channel Japsby on YouTube. He's got a lot of videos on all different wars throughout history. Today he released a video on the Haitian Revolution. I'll actually be narrating one of his videos this month, so be sure to subscribe and check it out. Links are in the description below. To begin this topic, we'll be comparing 3 categories in order to evaluate who fielded the better army, starting with leadership. The most notable American leader is, of course, George Washington. Appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775, Washington was quick to take action.
You know, it's important to note, too, that I think a lot of people had this impression because of the white powdered wig that Washington wore that he was an older guy by this point. Washington's in his, I think, early 40s during the Revolutionary War, at least when it starts out. So he's a fairly young guy. I mean, he's like my age when the war breaks out. He's certainly not a spring chicken, but he's not an old man either.
Successfully forced the British garrison out of Boston in 1776, but was defeated and almost captured that same year in New York City.
Yep. Still,
his tactical innovation and strategic prowess are proven in the battles of Trenton, Princeton, and Yorktown, to name a few.
I hesitate to agree with him on this. Yes, Trenton and Princeton are Washington at his finest, but we have to ignore things like Kips Bay, Brandywine, the battles, for New York, even Yorktown. Honestly, he didn't want to go to Yorktown. He had to be talked into that by the French. He wanted to go after New York City. So I hesitate to call Washington a brilliant tactician based on those couple of successes, because he also had some pretty horrible disasters of leadership as well. That wasn't where Washington's strength really was. His strength was in his leadership ability with men, being able to select and surround himself with qualified people. He was very good at that, and he knew how to hold it all together.
The next American general is Horatio Gates.
Ugh.
Responsible for the American victories at Saratoga, Gates gained recognition early on.
Not
but
really.
Just as Gates is remembered for Saratoga, he's also remembered for the major defeat suffered at the Battle of Camden.
And let's be honest about Saratoga. The victory at Saratoga honestly belongs to Benedict Arnold, not to Horatio Gates. Gates got the credit for it, and he built a career on that. But yeah, Camden was a debacle. He not only loses, but he rides day and night for like 2 or 3 days. He's 100 miles away from his army by the time he stops.
Which was a huge blow to American morale. As a consequence, he was replaced by the much more competent Nathaniel Greene, a favorite of George Washington, who eventually defeated the British in the South. Finally, there's Benedict Arnold, who captured Fort Ticonderoga, a crucial position in upstate New York. This action would soon be overshadowed, however, by his betrayal of the American cause in the middle of the war.
And we have to talk about, there's other generals too that are, Marquis de Lafayette was a major general, commanded a division. He was highly regarded. Benjamin Lincoln's a solid commander that was highly regarded. He was Washington's second in command at Yorktown, but had lost previously in the South. But Nathaniel Greene's solid. He's probably one of the best generals to come out of the American Revolution.
On the British side, we have three significant commanders. The first is William Howe, the man who led the British to their Pyrrhic victory at Bunker Hill. After the battle, he replaced Thomas Gage as commander-in-chief of the British forces in America. Howe would go on to successfully capture Philadelphia, but because of poor communication, this meant that the army of John Burgoyne, another British commander, would be trapped without support and eventually forced to surrender.
I don't know if it's poor communication or if it's just ignoring orders. The point was that they were supposed to try and split the colonies in half by capturing the Hudson Valley, which really did divide New England, the Hudson River, which is the border between New York and the rest of New England. And they were supposed to kind of do this pincer movement. And Howe's like, nah, I'm going for Philadelphia instead. It was just a major blunder that might have cost them the war.
Shortly after Howe's blunder, he was replaced with Sir Henry Clinton in 1778, who would remain in the position of commander-in-chief for the majority of the war. The last British commander I'd like to mention is Charles Cornwallis, who was mostly active in New England and the Middle Colonies in the initial stages of the war, but was later reassigned to the Southern Theater, where he made great progress in Georgia and the Carolinas before overextending and being forced to surrender at Yorktown.
And Cornwallis, not a lot of people know this, but toward the end of the war, his wife died back in England. And this, I'm sure, had a significant impact on the man. But he was a pretty competent commander. What happened to him at Yorktown, I wouldn't blame on him. I would blame on Clinton not reinforcing him. Cornwallis had an expectation of the Navy relieving him, of Clinton sending support, and both of those things failed him. The Navy got beat at the Battle of the Chesapeake by the French, and then, of course, Clinton never sent the troops, at least not in time. So I don't pin those things on Cornwallis. Cornwallis, incidentally, was still highly regarded after the war. He goes on to become Governor General of Ireland for a while. He's made a Knight of the Garter, which is the highest order of chivalry in Britain. He eventually is sent to India to be the Governor General there, and that's where he died. And he's actually got a really beautiful tomb there in India.
From this, we can infer that the British generals tended to be more experienced and better educated, although this was negated by the presence of other factors, such as the sheer distance from Great Britain, which delayed the delivery of troops and supplies. Yeah. In the case of American generals, most of their experience came from the 7 Years' War. This would give them superior knowledge of the terrain. Their main disadvantage would be the lack of organization. In terms of pure tactical ability, American commanders held a slight advantage, as evident in the cunning victories at Trenton and Cowpens.
I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like tactically the British were more sound. I just think that the Americans were better at adapting their tactics to the type of war that they created. But a lot of the Americans' success came from that kind of fall back, make your larger enemy force that has to go deep into enemy territory and maintain supply lines, make him chase you and divide up. It's what was done to Santa Anna during the Mexican War for Independence, or the Texas War for Independence. It's happened throughout history. When you are a smaller, weaker force, that's what you have to do.
The next category we'll evaluate is troop discipline and tactics. If you've seen any TV documentary on the American Revolution, it's usually stated directly that the Americans were superior in their combat abilities in almost every way just because they utilized guerrilla tactics.
I disagree.
And while there is some truth to this, it was the Continental Army that won battles and the irregular troops who retreated from those battles. Yeah. It's also said that along with the Minutemen, the Riflemen were game changers on the battlefield. But as stated in Battles of the American Revolutionary War 1775 to 1781 by W.J. Wood, at full strength, the Riflemen could muster some 960 men, less than 3% of the Army's total numbers.
That said, you got to remember most rank and file soldiers did not have rifles. They had muskets, and the difference, of course, is accuracy and range. Those rifles had much more accuracy, much more range, but like he said, they didn't make up a large part of the army. But the Americans did target officers, and that was considered uncivilized by the British, and they really had a major problem with the fact the Americans did that, but the Americans did that because they had to do that.
I can say confidently, then, that it's simply untrue that American rifles and militia won the war. The American militiamen were untrained, under-equipped, and most importantly, unobligated to fight. Oftentimes, they would simply leave and go home if they didn't want to fight anymore.
True.
A British redcoat, meanwhile, could fire much more regularly and was more often than not equipped with a bayonet, making for devastating charges.
That's an excellent point. When you have inaccurate weapons that take a long time to reload, the bayonet can be a game changer when you get in close enough to use it. And by and large, the Continental Army did not have bayonets.
Lastly, the British would always have a detachment of elite grenadiers on the right flank, which would often break the American line, especially if the American forces were composed of militia, as seen at the Battle of Camden.
Fire! Prime and low.
The last category we'll evaluate is equipment and supplies. Infantry equipment was the logistical priority for both the British and American armies. The British were armed with the Brown Bess, a .71 caliber flintlock musket. The Americans, on the other hand, were mainly equipped with the .69 caliber Charleville musket, which was supplied by the French. Both sides did utilize riflemen in the war, but of course the Americans were better known for it, wielding the infamous Kentucky long rifle, as seen here. We can say then that the only significant differences between each side's army was that of supply. The British supply lines during the majority of the war were stretched very thin, causing them to stay close to ports to receive reinforcements and foodstuffs. This constraint also prevented the British armies from pursuing the American forces inward. Even when the British could use the ports they captured, getting resupplied and reinforced took 1 to 4 months.
That's all true, and yet there were significant supply issues on the American side too, which I'm sure he'll talk about. Washington was constantly writing to, or having Hamilton write on his behalf to the Continental Congress, demanding more supplies, more powder, more of everything, and pay for that matter. Late in the war, there were some significant mutinies by Continental line troops because they weren't getting paid, and they had been promised they would be.
Despite Britain's logistical constraints, the Americans were in no better a position. Such can be seen at Washington's Valley Forge encampment, where about 2,000 of his 12,000 soldiers died to malnutrition and disease.
A lot of people like to talk about Valley Forge, but honestly, I don't think Valley Forge was the worst winter that they suffered. I would say that it was the following year. The winter, I think they were at Morristown, New Jersey the following year, and it was actually worse, I think.
Losses like this were commonplace in the Continental Army, at least early on. For this reason, the British held a slight advantage in supply. So with all of this said, the British were better disciplined, well-equipped, and led by somewhat competent commanders, whereas the Americans lost more battles, were short on supplies, undertrained, and only compensated by a few notable commanders. How then did the British lose? Well, we're forgetting 2 crucial categories: war support and grand strategy. Let's start with war support. The cause of the Patriots had significant support in the colonies. The idea of political independence was highly appealing, much more than that of loyalty to the crown, especially in the north, where British financial restrictions hurt American merchants. As the war continued, the British were increasingly seen as foreign invaders, and the actions of commanders such as Bannister Tarleton helped support this belief. Despite this, the Patriots were never fully able to control the entirety of the American countryside, as there was a strong core of loyalist supporters of Great Britain. Internationally, the American cause was more popular, with the French, Spanish, and Dutch all supporting the Patriot cause.
And it wasn't so much about supporting the Americans as sticking it to the British. Anytime you got a chance to stick it to the British, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There was no great love for the patriotic cause in America as much as that.
Though it was more out of a desire to oppose British hegemony than out of appreciation for Republican ideals. Some notable figures who really helped America reform their army were Baron von Steuben and Marquis de Lafayette. Something I find really interesting is that the largest battle of the American Revolution was actually fought at Gibraltar, and though the British came out victorious, it's just one of many examples of how overextended Britain became as America received more and more international support.
And honestly, that was Spain's main reason for getting involved, was a chance to get Gibraltar. An interesting thing about Lafayette, and I don't remember the name of the American commander, but when we sent troops to fight in France in World War I, they did this whole ceremony at Lafayette's grave in Paris. Incidentally, he's buried under dirt, I think, from one of the battlefields. I don't know if it's Monmouth or what, but anyway, they did this whole ceremony, and it ended with them saying, "Lafayette, we are here." And I just find that very poignant and very beautiful, because when they were in the midst of the French Revolution, we pretty much abandoned France, even though we had been allies just a few years before. And so it was kind of it coming full circle, and American troops saying, we're finally here to fight for France.
Indeed, the British saw virtually no foreign support during the Revolution. With regards to strategy, the Americans had the edge compared to the British, even if it changed as the war continued. At the outbreak of hostilities, the American army fought in a conventional manner, engaging the British on their own terms, and even launching some attacks into Britain's Canadian territories. Needless to say, most of these attacks failed, severely crippling American military strength. The British strategy initially was to secure the cities of New England, thinking that once the capital of the Revolution fell, so too would the morale of the Patriots. Although they did capture most of New England, they were poorly coordinated. This could be seen when William Howe left Burgoyne in upstate New York to face the Continental Army while he captured Philadelphia. He underestimated the strength of the Americans, and what followed was one of the largest British military disasters of the time, as Burgoyne lost his whole army and was captured. Howe also found that even though Philadelphia was occupied, the Americans hadn't lost their will to fight. After realizing his strategy was not fit for the Americas, he resigned and left Henry Clinton in charge. The second phase of the war took place in the South, after Clinton realized that the North was too heavily populated with patriots. Washington and Nathaniel Greene had revised their strategy after destroying the British at Saratoga.
And as I mentioned in previous videos, Washington's first choice to lead the American troops in the South was Nathaniel Greene, but he was overruled by members of the Continental Congress, and they put Horatio Gates in charge. Gates was part of this cabal, Gates, Charles Lee, Thomas Conway, others, to try and get rid of Washington as being incompetent and take his place. So they send Gates, partially because Gates had a lot of friends in the Continental Congress, but also to get him away from Washington, give him his own independent command. But as we know, that was a complete disaster. Then Washington gets his man and gets Greene down there. And there are some disasters in the South, but they're right about one thing, and that is that there is a lot more loyalist sentiment in the Carolinas in particular. So it was a good strategy. It makes sense.
But unfortunately, Horatio Gates learned nothing. Gates engaged General Cornwallis in the South in an open-pitched battle and lost a huge portion of his men, after which he was relieved by Nathaniel Greene. Cornwallis and his staff, emboldened by their victory, continued to push through Georgia and North Carolina. Learning from his previous mistakes, however, Greene slowly pulled Cornwallis away from his supply lines by continuously drawing him into small skirmishes, until Cornwallis was forced to abandon his campaign and retreat to the port of Yorktown, where he was trapped by the French Navy, with Washington expecting him. By viewing the American Revolution as simply a fight between the British soldier and American soldier, all evidence would point to a British victory. But when you factor in that the Americans had help from tens of thousands of foreign soldiers and supplies, and were employing brilliant new strategies, you can see that the Americans were able to hold on until the British lost their will to fight.
And that was really the thing. And honestly, if you look at the parallels between this and the American Civil War a few generations later, that was really the only way the South could have won, would have been similar support from Europe and being able to outlast the Northern will to fight. It happened in the Revolution when the British people finally gave up. Parliament turned against it, wouldn't fund it anymore, and finally passed a bill saying it's done, we're done with this. It didn't happen in the American Civil War.
Even though Cornwallis was captured and lost his whole army, the British could have sent another one, but they didn't, because support for the war was virtually gone. And it is for all of these reasons combined that the British suffered such a defeat. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out Jabsy's channel in the description below. Now I'd like to thank my general staff on Patreon: Fritz, Joe Crispin, Brenden Wuwan, Derek Bello, Jake Hart, PJ Nave, Eric Greenwood, Patrick Reardon.
All right, we'll let that go. I'll encourage you to watch the original video and make sure you give him a like. Good stuff. I'm impressed. He seems like a pretty young guy, but he obviously knows what he's talking about. I like the animation. It was all really cool. We'll definitely look into some more of his videos at some point. But let me know what you think about all that. Use the comment section below. I will link to the original video in the description. Make sure you head over and subscribe to the Armchair Historian. Give him some support. Thanks for watching.